Story 1. I have pulmonary fibrosis, a terminal condition that has compromised my lungs, leaving me with 40% lung capacity. I have had the below experience 4 times now in the last 2 weeks under similar circumstances. On the night in question, I fell asleep and started dreaming. Within a few minutes, things took a very dark turn. Before I realize it, I'm suffocating in my dream. In actuality, my nose had almost completely clogged up. My mouth failed to open up. As a result, I was suffocating. Since it started as a dream, I couldn't tell that I really was having a problem. I had incorporated the suffocation into my dream. Meanwhile, internally, I'm having a terrible time where I was trying to flag the dream people down to inform them that I needed help, as I was having a hard time breathing. The most notable aspect of the dream portion of the experience was that the more my body shut down physically, the more the color systematically drained out of the dream landscape. It dawned on me that everything had turned an ashen gray color. My thought processes also started to slow significantly, until I simply couldn't think anymore. This all took place in what felt like about 2 minutes. Everything in the dream quite literally froze in place like a gray snapshot that felt as completely dead and lifeless as I did. Dying was as mercifully brief as it was horrific. I realized that I had a sudden gentle urge to look upwards at the sky. The sky was the only thing that contained any color. It was a nice bright blue. The moment I turned my gaze upwards, 4 things happened. I became lucid and could suddenly think clearly. I felt alive again. The dead dream landscape faded, and my human personality and ego switched off like a light bulb, leaving me free to fully embrace myself as spirit. The tunnel had formed over my head, drawing me into it at a high rate of speed. The only thing I focused on was the light and God. I kept repeating God, God, God to focus my thoughts as I traveled. The tunnel walls were pure black with a beautiful gold light pulsating through and encircling the tunnel. At the end of the tunnel was a brilliant golden light. As I began to travel through the tunnel, I came to the realization that my body was nearing its end. Although I was still strongly aware of my body and its dire situation, I resolved to continue through the tunnel to the end of it. Since I had experienced this scenario on 2 other occasions the prior week, I now felt like an old pro with regards to the tunnel. The thought occurred to me that there were only 2 reasons I would be going through it. Rather, I was already dead, or the body was currently engaged in the death process and was not long for the world. Either way, I felt as though I needed to complete the journey with all possible speed, as I had no intention of needlessly hanging around Earth's astral plane. The further I flew through the astral plane, the more I lost awareness of the body. I felt nothing but dread in the last moments of the dream. Yet in the tunnel, I felt the complete opposite. I was happy and content. The flight through the tunnel was what I would describe as entirely pleasant. I did have the dim awareness of the body lightly flailing around back in my bedroom. I concluded it was essentially a husk and I needn't pay it any mind. I had hoped that it would stop struggling so I could be free. After all, I wasn't having any problems. I didn't need to breathe as that was a problem the body had to deal with, not me. The further I went through the tunnel, the more my senses and thought processes cleared, reaching maximum clarity at the end. There was an overwhelming feeling that I was finally going home. I half expected to sail right through the light to the other side. Instead, I was instantly stopped just before entering it. It was a huge wall of golden light that looked 500 feet tall and was just as wide. It was impossible to ignore as there was nothing but complete blackness everywhere else. I knew it as the void. This was a point of no return. I knew definitively that if I passed through the veil that this body would expire immediately. There was no going back after this. For the moment, I was still attached to it. I remember thinking that it would be a shame to arbitrarily relinquish an otherwise marginally serviceable body when there's no compelling reason to do so. Yet, I wanted to go through the veil in the worst way. I could sense an almost indescribable feeling of goodwill and happiness coming from the other side. I also felt a massive surge of feeling explaining to me that the spirit world is a very happening place. I felt many friendly souls were just beyond the veil. Most of the things I felt were beyond description. Be that as it may, I felt I would not only be shirking my duty to this form, but offending God by making the decision to leave the world prematurely. It struck me as the height of irresponsibility to do so. As painful as it was to leave the light, I chose to return to the world. I woke up for all of 10 seconds and promptly fell back asleep. Again, I found myself in the same position. My nose was still clogged and I hadn't woken up long enough to clear my airway. This time, I instantly looked up at the sky and once again found myself rocketing through the tunnel. As best I could figure it, the trip took 10 seconds. This time at the wall of light, I stayed for a bit longer than before. I started to get images of what was on the other side awaiting me if I finished this incarnation properly. It was nothing short of fascinating. Several images of what looked like a morphing set of clouds turning into grand halls and vistas unfolded before my eyes. Although I left again, I became frustrated that I wasn't allowed to cross over yet. This time, after I woke up, I made sure to clear my airway before getting up to contemplate everything that happened over that last week. I've gone through the entire range of emotions, from moroseness and depression due to not being allowed to cross over, to extreme happiness that I finally know what happens to us when we die. A few days ago, I was given knowledge that I was supposed to undergo this experience now. I completely lost my fear of death. Indeed, I excitedly look forward to when my time finally comes. And aside, I was flipping through Pinterest and kept coming across a repeating encouragement card which stated, "It's worth it. Your patience will be rewarded." No matter how far I scrolled down the list, it was the only thing that was a constant repeat. It serves to reassure me that I made the right decision, however disappointing it was. I look at it often to remind me of why I came back. This story was shared by Nicholas G. and happened in 2022.
Story 2. The first NDE I had was in 1959. I was 7 years old. It was a beautiful October afternoon and my friend and I were running down the sidewalk. Our feet tangled and I fell. When I got up, my right arm had an extra bend about 6 inches above the wrist. I showed my mom and she improvised a splint out of a big old Life magazine and masking tape and took me to the hospital. At the hospital, I remember seeing the black anesthesia mask, and then the next thing I knew, I was effortlessly hovering in a huge, dark black area. This was not scary or anything like that. It felt calm and not any real emotional tone to it, comfortable. Then I noticed toward my lower right area a swirling light, like a whirlpool of light far away. I thought it was interesting and decided to go look at it and started moving that way. Then a voice came, an adult male voice who seemed to be in his mid-30s probably. He was speaking in my usual accent and he said, No, go back, you still have lots to do." I just said, "Oh, okay." And that was the end of it. I woke up and they were finishing my cast. The voice seemed to come from behind and above my left shoulder. The second NDE was in 1988, again a gorgeous October afternoon. You couldn't ask for a prettier day. A friend and I had decided to go horseback riding in the field behind my house. I was not an experienced rider by any means, but I had heard that you are supposed to wear boots to prevent your foot from being caught in the stirrup if you fall. Well, that is no guarantee. The horse bucked me off and my left foot stayed in the stirrup, and I was dragged and kicked for a while. As soon as my shoulder and upper back area hit the ground, my sense of time expanded, and it seemed like I had all the time in the world to think this over. The physical sensations of being kicked were much like being in a cardboard box that someone is tapping with a stick. I felt and heard the impacts, but they were distant and painless. I was aware that physical damage was happening, and that this couldn't go on for too long. Later, I counted over 30 hoof prints in my legs. Mentally, my mind somehow analyzed my physical situation very logically and looked for possible actions I could take to save myself. There was nothing I could do except wait this out and see how it goes. At this time, a neat visual thing started happening, like a kaleidoscope of moving colors. Pure, glowing colors that were very beautiful and interesting to watch. This was the most pleasant and actually the only option of any available activities for me, and so I chose to watch and was very intrigued. I was watching my light show and then the same voice as before spoke to me again from over my left shoulder. He said to me, "Remember last time?" I was kind of busy and said, "Yes, of course I remember." He said, "Well, this time is different." I was waiting for him to continue this thought, but he didn't. So I asked, "How so? How is it different?" He said, "This time it can go either way." I already knew that. So I watched the lights and waited to see if he was going to say anything more. It was indicated to me somehow that to move to my lower left would be to die now. Also that dying would not be held against me, which seemed a little odd. Is dying sometimes held against us? Then to move to the upper right would be to continue this life, like finishing a project of some sort. Then the emotional tone of blocks of years in this life's future was indicated, and I felt confident that these projections were factual. This would be some change in what my life had been up to that point, and kind of better. No details were shown, just the feeling of it. Now remember, there is nothing I can do here to physically change my outcome, being dragged by the foot by a big, strong animal. So this is interesting information, but not really applicable. I continued watching the lights and waiting. Then he said, "You have to choose," kind of emphatically. I thought, okay, if it makes you happy. I chose on the basis of, if I die now, I can't change my mind, but if I choose to live this life, I can always die later. So I indicated that I would choose to live. Worth noting here is that at this time I did not have any children, and so less incentive to survive to take care of someone else. Nothing changed at that point, still watching lights, still being dragged and kicked. Then he said, "You need to ask." More urgently this time. I then started to think the word please, and about halfway through that thought my foot came out of the boot and the accident was over. Time returned to its normal flow. My first thought then was that I had better find out if I could get up, and I was able to do that. The changes in my life that had been indicated did indeed come to pass. This covered the next 15 years or so. There weren't any specific details, but the emotional climate change was pretty significant. I don't believe I personally orchestrated this, but how would you know for sure? I have since also had several precognitive dreams involving deaths of loved ones. It seems I usually have about a week's notice for deaths happening. At no point in either experience did I feel any love at all, much less unconditional love. Nor did I feel any fear or unpleasantness. These were pretty matter-of-fact events. The voice I heard did not claim to be Jesus, but he did seem to have more knowledge than what was available to me. The feeling I got from him was pretty much like someone just doing their job. He found me to be a little slow and stubborn, not impressed with me. Very interesting is the timing of the word please and my foot coming out of the boot simultaneous with that. This story was shared by Gail C. and happened in 1959 and 1988.